Thousands of hours of research and manpower into the status of education in our nation has produced some fascinating results. One of our nation's most focused think tanks, Cardis, feels education is the most crucial battleground to insist upon truth and free thinking. My guest today will explain what this all means for the upcoming generation of Canadians. Thanks for being with me, David.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Tell me quickly, what is Cardis? And because you work with them, correct?
Yeah, so Cardis is a think tank. And for those that don't know the think tank world, we kind of, I guess you could say, if you think of it an intersection or a roundabout, on one spoke you got government policy, another spoke you got academic research, another spoke you got media and public narrative. So we're right at the middle of all of that as a think tank. But where Cardis is unique is we're the only Christian think tank in Canada. And so as a result, we're very interested in culture and very interested in civil society and impacting and feeding academic research, government policy, and media narrative the best that we can.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, you guys have been doing a lot of research and studies on education.
Yes.
And I'd love to talk about that a little bit. Talk to me just kind of in a big look, 50,000 square miles high. What's going on in education now that we're living in a post-pandemic society? Has education really taken a hit?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. A number of ways that we could respond to that. Yes, the pandemic, like the worst hit space was education. You think of one way that it's been termed is you have students have been described in terms of there's three buckets. So those who are in-person education, in a schoolroom, in a classroom is bucket one. Those who are online would be bucket two. But what very few are talking about is bucket three. Those who didn't have internet access or at home, perhaps things were complicated at home, perhaps they didn't have a good home life, so they couldn't participate in remote learning like everyone else. And
right.
Wide, you're looking at 500 million students that are in that third category. In England, they're calling them ghost children. Here in Canada, it's probably about 300,000 students that are unaccounted for in this last, 2 years has it been? 2.5 years? Education of any space in terms of how COVID policies have affected life, education is probably the worst hit for sure. And that opens up opportunity because that's exposed cracks in the public system that were already there, but of course put them on steroids. And then two, showed parents there are alternatives, whether that's in Christian school, whether that's homeschool, whether it's something totally different and unique. So yeah, definitely the educational landscape has changed, and I think will continue to change because of the COVID policies that we had the last few years.
Yeah, you'd think that parents, so many parents are just glad that their kids go to school and they get okay marks. I think this must have caused parents to really take an active role as they see what's going on. I've talked to some parents who just say, like, watching my kid online and seeing what they're learning, and some didn't like it, some were impressed with the schools they were in. But as you're saying, a lot of kids have fallen through the cracks.
Yes, and also the content of what's being taught or not being taught. And again, every jurisdiction was different. There are definitely teachers that worked around the clock and were absolute all-stars. There's some amazing stories out there. Yes. So let's be careful. But for a lot, yeah, there was little education going on, and in some cases, I think parents have been exposed to what is being taught in many schools, and there's definitely some flags that have been raised. Let's just say it that way.
All right, so let's take a look at some of this stuff. Independent schools and public schools, as you're looking at them. Who got hit the hardest, maybe who responded well in what areas? Talk to me a little bit about them, independent and public schools.
Yeah, so it depends what audience we're talking to, what jurisdiction we're in. Every jurisdiction was different. There were some places like, I don't know what the school district is called, but up in Grand Prairie, for example, they were all-stars. There you had, in the public school system, in the Grand Prairie area, you had reading and math. You had students advancing. I'm hoping to do a report on this soon, advancing almost 2 years in terms of the quality of education that was up there. But that's one of the only success stories that you have in the public space. Places like Ontario, it was a total disaster, probably the worst jurisdiction in all of North America in terms of how often schools were closed, how little response there was, how little education was actually going on. Then if we look at the Christian education space, we did 2 studies looking at samples in Ontario of the Christian schools sector and seeing how did Christian schools respond to the pandemic. And what's and the funny thing is we report on this for Ontario, but schools in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, people have told me this is happening all over. But in the Christian school space, 48%, so half of schools did not miss a single day. The lockdown began heading into spring break. So over spring break, you had teachers and administration working around the clock to make sure they got up on remote, got online. And so that half of schools, half of students didn't miss a single day, and 84% of schools missed less than 4 days. So a very rapid, very nimble response. And then if you look at then what continued, the quality of the education, there was guidelines given by the Ministry of Education. They were doing on average at least double what those requirements were. So the education in the Christian space, it didn't take the same hit. And so as you would expect, enrollment's gone up. Inquiries into those schools, as you would expect, of course, have gone up as a result. So a very, very different response in the different sectors.
So how bad was it in some of the public school spaces? Like I've got families who are teachers, family members, and I mean, I don't even know where to start because I mean, that's not my area, but it was, even if they went, there wasn't much happening, and it was bad.
No, and I shouldn't have laughed there. That was a gut response, but the reality is that's actually tragic.
Yeah.
Because what's happened to these kids, like this is affecting a whole generation.
Yep.
And we're going to really see the effects of this 20, 30, 40 years from now. And even things like, there's one study I was briefly looking at a few weeks ago about around life expectancy, and how when you've, the kind of stuff that's gone down in the education space, there's projections you're going to see life expectancy decrease for this generation that's coming up, which is the generation of my kids. So how we're in the weeds of that. There's some studies we're doing at the moment in that respect, but the reality is there's tons of anecdotes. There's very little empirical evidence at this point. But
what do you? Okay, I got to ask this question then. So what I'm hearing you say, or correct me if I'm wrong, is that because of how we've handled education, it's shortening lifespan?
Well, because you have a strong correlation between how well you live. So human flourishing is directly correlated with education. So if you can't read, for example, or you really struggle in reading, writing, arithmetic, you're going to really struggle in terms of your career prospects, and even things like marriage stability. All those things are correlated, because you have someone who struggles in their career, that then carries over into their family life. Mm-hmm. And diet, all the rest of it. So no, there's tons of research showing a very strong correlation between academic outcomes and life expectancy and quality of life. So what we've seen the last 2-3 years, where kids are not being educated, and in Canada, where there's 300,000 students unaccounted for that just disappeared. Again, as Britain's calling ghost children. What's going to happen to those kids? And there will be, of course, again, over the next 40 years, there's going to be tons and tons of research looking back on this, but the total disaster in terms of government response, but also too, as you would know, government overreach.
Yeah.
And a totally inappropriate response to the situation that was at hand.
Talk to me about woke curriculum. This, during the last couple of years, this really has been a word that has risen up. I don't think a lot of people still understand what that means, what that is. What should concerned parents know about what is going on in the public school system, universities, wherever, when it comes to woke curriculum?
Yeah, so this one, we haven't done a ton of research on this space because there's so many others that are speaking to this. So we haven't done a ton in this space.
Okay.
One paper that we did do recently was we were looking at how schools talk about religion, how curriculum talks about religion. In I believe the provinces we looked at were British Columbia, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Ontario. And do they even talk about religion? If so, how is it presented? And Ontario was an outlier in a very positive way. Ontario, actually, they do talk about religion throughout the curriculum. It's either neutral or even sometimes positive. In Nova Scotia, it's almost always neutral. But in Manitoba and British Columbia, BC, where I'm from, religion is, first of all, almost never ever talked about in the curriculum. And when it is, it may be neutral, but it's typically negative, and it's really at arm's length. Like it's this historical artifact, if you will. But what's interesting is Indigenous spirituality is seen as a positive, and that's talked about. But yet it really, it's not an accurate representation of Indigenous Canadians. As you and I know, the large majority of Indigenous Canadians are Christian. Stats Canada says 2/3. 2/3 of Indigenous Canadians self-identify as Christian, only 4.5%. So less than 1 in 20 identify as Indigenous, some form of Aboriginal spirituality. So for the curriculum to portray that as the norm, and Christianity to be seen as this artifact, colonial, this colonial artifact, very inaccurate. And so that's, with all the woke stuff, it's really often it has to do with the how Christianity is portrayed and inaccurately portrayed, or just religion is outright not talked about.
Let's talk a little bit about schooling and the kinds of schooling. You're talking about homeschooling, unschooling, pod schooling. I'm hearing different terms like that. What does the landscape look like for parents as to what should they be doing with their kids?
Sure. Okay, so we have a really cool paper coming out. Hopefully this year. I'm just wrapping it up. We're working on the final draft, looking at it again. This is in Ontario, but looking at how diverse the non-government school landscape is. It's extraordinarily diverse, and this is, of course, the case actually in every province. In places like Alberta, you've seen homeschool enrollment more than double since the pandemic, and that's kind of standard across North America. But then what does that even look like? So in the homeschool community in particular, these aren't kids just at the kitchen table or in a bedroom all by themselves all day working on whatever. No, what's standard is cooperatives, where you get multiple families together, they meet together, maybe it's on Wednesday, they'll do some sports together, maybe on Friday. You have different parents that specialize in different subjects, and then they'll take a few hours with the children. But the amount of socialization and community that you have in the homeschool community, it's extraordinary. And then, of course, learning pods, which tend to be more teacher-driven than parent or student-driven, where it's teachers that were very frustrated with the lack of education happening in the public system during lockdowns, who said, hey, we got to find alternatives. And so once things opened up, they said, hey, we have expertise, we know how to teach, let's start these little pods. And they tend to be kind of like micro schools. So the one room schoolhouse sort of concept is coming back, and there's a lot of those, again, all over the place. But for parents, you got to find the right fit, and that's what it comes down. Every kid is different. And
so for pods, do they go to the pod, or is it just online, or both?
No, those would be primarily in person. Often they're happening in church basements. They may not be, they're rarely affiliated with the church,
right?
But usually in church basements, they'll be meeting in person, typically somewhere between 20 to 30 kids, usually. Typically a learning pod, it's a teacher or 2 or 3 teachers that really care about education, really love kids, and are really frustrated with where they're at professionally, although they're being paid well. They want to teach kids. So they've organized, similar to a homeschool co-op, kind of like a micro mini school, but where you come, it's typically Monday to Friday for learning pods. Whereas a homeschool co-op, you'd have 1, 2, maybe 3 days a week. Parents are coming together, and a homeschool co-op is going to be parent driven. Parents are leading all the content, whereas a learning pod tends to be teachers who have left the system who are leading it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So then legally, you would sign your kids are going to school when it comes to the pod schooling.
So, and that's where it gets fishy. So, and there's a bit of a regulatory gray zone.
Yep.
Where often with learning pods, they are registered as homeschool families, school kids.
Right.
And so it may be half a day they're going. Again, the regulations on even what a school is, that needs to be updated, frankly, in virtually every province.
So people, like when I chat with parents all the time about the schooling stuff, and so I hear it from people like, for example, there is no way I could homeschool my child. I mean, when I look at the math in junior high, they'll say, or when I can't even remember what a participle is, or so. Let's just kind of digress a little bit. So for homeschooling, for those who don't know anything about it, there is a ton of help to those who want to be starting homeschooling. And it's not as much time as a normal school. What would be some of your pluses for homeschooling?
Yeah, no, you're right. There's a ton of resources, and the amount of communities out there. Even just hop on Facebook, the amount of Facebook groups dedicated to homeschooling, and I can almost guarantee wherever you're from, there's going to be one in your community or somewhere nearby. A bunch of parents that are switched on, that have already done the legwork to find, okay, here's great curriculum, here's great approaches. So the big thing is get plugged into a community. That would be my advice: is find a community of parents.
Because you need community. Are there any?
Community.
Have you noticed any? Like for me, it would kind of be like, have you noticed any Christian schools that have teamed up with homeschooling parents?
Oh yeah.
What does that blend look like?
Yeah, so typically they're called hybrid schools. The technical name out in British Columbia here is distributed learning schools. Okay. So the one Christian school that's at my church, K-12 school, but then they also have a distributed learning school where students come 1 or 2 days a week. They'll be with a teacher who's a certified teacher for that day or two. The rest of the time they're at home homeschooling.
In classrooms or in their own unique classrooms?
No. So they'll come into a classroom setting. Now in this particular case, the distributed learning school is separate from the main school. They have their own separate rooms.
Okay.
You will come, you're part of the classroom. It's the same kids that you're with every Friday or Wednesday, whatever it is. You come together. It is a classroom setting for 1 or 2 days. The other days you're at home, but even being at home, the parents aren't on their own. You have a supervisor who checks in a very appropriate way to come alongside parents and make sure students are being educated.
Is there some kind of a fee? Because one of the problems for Christian schools is always the finances, trying to finance it.
Yes.
So is there a much smaller amount they pay, or what have you noticed amongst the Christian schools that are doing hybrid stuff with homeschools?
Yeah, substantially lower fees.
Yes.
Lower fees, and then it depends what province you're in. If you're in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, or Quebec, there is government funding as well. It's partial funding, but about half the costs in most of those provinces are covered. In Ontario, that's not the case. But again, for a hybrid school, the costs are substantially less. And the reality is, we can afford what we prioritize. Even a lower middle class or working class family, the things that really matter to you, you make it happen. And the education of your kids, I would argue, is one of the most, if not the most important thing. And where there's a will, there's a way. And hybrid schools do tend to be much, much more affordable, and something that even a working class family can afford.
That sounds excellent. Yeah, I think as you look at what's been happening, you'd think that people and their creative ability would begin to figure out systems to manage and to handle both groups, the groups who want them to leave for the day and get full-on teacher attention, and those that can afford maybe the 1 or 2 days. I've almost noticed that there's this void in our schools about teaching children what is democracy, what is freedom, where do we get freedom, what is, what is capitalism or free enterprise? Like some of these things, it's almost like they don't know anything about it. Has it been removed from our schools and our universities?
Not removed, but it's not emphasized the way it ought to be.
Like citizenship.
Yeah. And what does that mean? What does that look like? What is good citizenship?
Yeah.
And we got to get away, first and foremost, from the myth of neutrality. Part of the problem in our schools, our secular public system, is there's this myth of neutrality, and that we're going to scrape morality from the curriculum and what the good is. So what does it mean to be a good citizen? I can't say, well, this is better than that. Well, no. All education is formation. So all education is preaching some form of morality, all of it. Mm-hmm. And say otherwise is to be either ignorant or to be dishonest. So then it's what is the good? And that's where Cardis's research, we're really big on outcomes. And let's look at outcomes. Let's look at what leads to human flourishing. And in terms of citizenship, what leads to social cohesion? What leads to respectful, appropriate disagreement where we can navigate differences and respect our differences? And that's where there's so much research on this. Like you have 34, 35, maybe even 36 very credible studies that have looked at what schools do the best job of forming good citizens, and the things we just finished talking about. And of those studies, so you got 86 separate statistically significant findings. Of those 86, 50 of them, 50. So the large majority find positive effects for independent schools, where independent schools do a statistically significant better job than any other school in forming good citizens. 30 studies find neutral effects, only 3. There's only 3 findings that show a state advantage. And that's the argument we always hear for public schools is, well, no, if we're going to have a cohesive citizenry, well, everyone's got to be going to the same school. And it was called, back in the day, was the common school. It's like, no. The research shows the opposite. And if you think just intuitively, like if I'm at the playground with my kids and I bump into another parent, well, where do you start the conversation? It's, oh, what do? You start talking about work, guaranteed. And especially in my case, they do something different than I do. So I got a bunch of questions. I learn about them. They learn about my work. They're like, hey, that's interesting. And it's our differences that make for super interesting conversation. They're like, hey, come to my place for a barbecue. Let's chat some more. And in terms of schools, it's no different, when schools are unique and different, and families are allowed to self-sort, and different students are allowed to go where they thrive and where they fit, it leads to a more cohesive and a more harmonious society. The evidence is overwhelming on that.
Probably the only attack I've heard on Christian schools has been, well, I want my kids to be raised in the real world so they know how to handle temptation and understand. Does that have any credence to it?
Okay, so here, it's funny you say that, because I was just thinking, how old was Jesus? God himself, how old was he when he entered his ministry? How old was he when he finally said, no, now I'm going to step into this role? And how old was he? Now, yes, when he was 12, what was he doing? He was in the temple debating the rabbis, debating the leaders. He was in the church debating pastors. It wasn't until he was 30 that he went into the world and launched into his ministry. Are kids really prepared for that? Are they really equipped for that? Education is formation. So who is forming your kids? Are your kids, and the way I like to say it is, are your kids missionaries, or are they the mission field? And I think more often than not, your kids are actually the mission field.
Yeah, that's true. I remember my mom and dad, and they would have company over. And the better the evening that they had with, coffee and food, was how good the debates were.
Sure.
And they'd even get emotional. I mean, they'd take their point, but there was such acceptance and respect that it made for a great conversation. You can only talk about something, I totally agree, I totally agree, I totally agree, so long, and it's just boring. And I've noticed as well that great minds treasure conversations where someone is holding you to task on something. There's a verse in the Bible that talks about that people are like a deep well, and it's the questions. It's questioning them that brings out the best.
Draws it out. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, exactly. Well, and even too, and what is education? Is education not conversation between the generations? So in terms of in real time in a classroom, a different generation teaching a different generation, okay. But then also too, what happens when you open a book? Like my favorite books tend to be hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And it's conversation. If you're engaging with that work and you're really processing, what is it I'm learning from this? It's a conversation with the generation. So that's exactly what education is.
Of the questions I get asked probably the most from parents with kids is they are really struggling. Do I even send my kid to university? And they're talking about the secular universities when they see what is going on. I mean, 30 years ago, there were studies. I think it was one of the, was it PAOC or one of them in Canada, that they were losing over 80% of their young people who no longer believed the Bible was the Word of God, the infallible Word of God, once they'd hit university. So is there any answers? Well, what are you seeing out there?
No, that's a big one. And the way I would tackle that one is, again, education is formation. And how well formed are your kids before they're getting into university? Like, they're not kids at that point. Like, once they're going off to university, and who primarily has responsibility for the education of children? It's mom and dad. And again, the evidence on this is overwhelming. You take the most robust and largest studies that have ever been done that show that the education outcomes of a kid and the trajectory of a kid by a mile the primary influence, the biggest influence is mom and dad,
Yep.
and who your parents are. And number two would then be teachers. So in terms of your own children, are they well formed at home so that they can go well? Because in the Great Commission, Matthew 28, I used to like to emphasize go, right?
Yeah.
Into all the world. But if we look in the Greek, what's the real emphasis there? It's make disciples, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded them. Make disciples, teaching them to obey. So have your children been formed as disciples of Christ to obey everything he's commanded? If the answer is no, and with that study where it says 80% walk away, well, I would argue they didn't really walk away, because were they even formed? Were they?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so my experience in secular university, all my degrees have been in secular institutions. I loved it. I thrived, because by the time I answered, I was ready for those debates. I was ready for that engagement, and I loved to have my faith challenged. I loved it. Yep. Because I had to refine, what do I believe in? And even what the show is called, like reason. So John chapter 1, in the beginning was the word that was with God. Well, what's that word there? Logos is the word where we get logic from. The word the Greeks called reason. In the beginning was reason. Reason was with God. Reason was God. There's nothing that God has done that's arbitrary. Right? That's why we can discover mathematics, we can discover science. We're exploring the mind of God in all of those fields. In the beginning was reason. So as a believer, I never have to be nervous around an antagonistic, hostile, atheistic professor that wants to expose or diminish my faith. No, the God I serve is the God of logic, is the God of reason, and so equipping young people. I think that's something that all of us need to do a better job of, it, first in our own homes, then also in the church, is forming young people.
The word disciple, a disciplined follower of Jesus Christ. We know that if you teach your children disciplines at a young age, it's 100 times easier than a full-grown adult, undisciplined in these areas, trying to become disciplined. So it's one of the greatest gifts you can give your children is to help them get disciplined in the beautiful teachings of the Bible.
Yes, and touching on that, one study we didn't talk about, that's one of our best recently done studies, is looking at the importance of a good fit in the K-12 education. So it's going out of your way, not being complacent, but finding a school that's a good fit. And we specifically looked at religious affiliation. And if a student who's whether Pentecostal or Baptist or whatever, Catholic, goes to, or even Muslim, goes to a school that reflects what's being taught at home and what's being taught at church on Sunday, those students had significantly better math and reading performance. And so in terms of preparing your kids for university, the best place to do that is in a school of good fit, or a homeschool co-op of good fit, where the values of the home are being reflected in what they're learning, and it will make a difference across the board, so that they're ready when they enter university to not only survive, but to thrive, absolutely thrive in that environment.
Man, our time is up. That's been so good. Thank you for being my guest today, David. This has been excellent.
My pleasure.
Looking at this, and I'd like to talk again. So we'll set something up, and we'll dive into this area, because it is a big issue right now to all of these parents. And I love what you closed with there, that parents cannot abdicate when it comes to the education of their children. If you've got parents who are excited about education, excited about the disciplines of Christ, teaching the Word, and it's not just, oh man, you can help your kids become amazing, and they will thrive anywhere when they grow up. So thank you so much for being with us today.